Hello, everyone. This is Emily Lyons. I am a partner with Husch Blackwell's Food Systems Group, and my practice focuses on the regulation of food and agricultural commodities. Thank you for joining our program today. Before we begin, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience panel, there are a number of applications for your use during the program today. If you have questions during the webcast, please submit them via the question box. We'll try to answer all questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, we will answer those via email. A PDF of the presentation is available in the program materials folder. This program has been approved for legal education hours. For live attendees, report your hours by clicking on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Towards the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. That's all for the housekeeping items, so let's get started. I'm very excited today to talk more about FDA's food traceability rules, since it's kind of a new revolution for us in the food world. Not that traceability is necessarily a new issue for us. However, this rule is very records-based and going to be intensive for companies to comply for those that make or that are producing products that are subject to the Food Traceability List. So we're going to go over a number of things, including an overview of the rule. We'll do a deeper dive only into certain elements of the program or of the regulation, primarily for time, but also because it does cover a broad array of different types of food products, many of which have unique issues that come up in their supply chains that would, they're a little more detailed than can be covered in a webinar. So starting with food traceability, as you know, FSMA was signed into law in 2011 with the intention of transforming the food system. Basically, we were shifting the focus from responding to foodborne illnesses through recalls or outbreak investigations to preventing it. And for those of you that are food manufacturers, you're very familiar with the preventative controls for human food rules, the intentional adulteration rule, and then potentially also the sanitary transport rule, depending on if your products are covered by that. In addition to those requirements, Section 204D of the Food Safety Modernization Act explicitly required FDA to designate certain high-risk foods that required additional record-keeping requirements. And these are really to capture the products that are the highest risk to public health. And FDA culminated its work on this in November of last year by publishing 21 CFR Subpart S, which is the additional traceability records for certain foods. So as an overview of the rule, it generally creates a number of new record-keeping practices for facilities to track these high-risk foods, which we'll talk about exactly what those are in a little bit. And it's primarily focused on responding to an illness or outbreak. This comes back from, many of the large foodborne illness outbreaks that we had prior to the passage of the Food Safety Modernization Act, where FDA as well as industry struggled to identify the widespread of food that may have been distributed subject to that. And, FDA really wants companies to focus on rapid response, identifying where the food is and pulling it from the market to protect public health as much as possible. In order to do that, FDA designates a food traceability list, and these are foods that are specifically subject to the additional requirements. Now, what FDA will tell you, and they have said very clearly, is yes, the regulatory requirements only apply to these foods. However, they highly encourage other industry members to think about tracking and tracing of food in a very similar way, even though it may not be legally required by the agency. Again, the point being rapid response and removal of products from the market that may cause public health harm. Additionally, it requires entities that perform certain events within the supply chains or certain activities. These are called key critical tracking events, or CTEs, at if you're engaged in a CTE, you must establish and maintain records that contain certain information. And this certain information are known as key data elements. And this information, so these critical tracking elements and then the specific key data elements, have to be linked to a traceability lot code for the lot of that product. Additionally, you need to establish a general traceability program as a traceability plan, and in addition to the records that need to be made and maintained for this plan. And then additionally, this is one area that is causing some concern since it could take quite a bit of effort depending upon how you choose to make and maintain these records. But FDA is requiring most entities subject to this rule to be able to provide an electronic sortable spreadsheet within 24 hours of FDA making such a request. These will generally happen in recall situations. Really, again, it is FDA wants to be able to identify what foods are implicated and where it may have gone through this traceability program. So the regulation only applies to individuals who manufacture, pack, process, or hold foods that either appear on the list or that contain a listed food as an ingredient, unless there's an exemption that applies. And that unless there is an exemption that applies, may cover a broad variety of foods, but we'll discuss those a little bit later. So FDA chose the foods subject to the rule and designated as high risk using a complicated risk ranking model for food tracing. If you really want to dig into the science related to that, there's a memorandum that FDA prepared regarding exactly what data elements it looked at, as well as how different foods ranked in this ranking model to determine what is subject to it. And FDA looked at very specific criteria, many of which were outlined in FSMA itself. But really, they are, again, looking at the products that have a high frequency of outbreaks or illness that cause severe illness, have a higher likelihood of contamination. They have the potential for pathogen growth throughout the shelf life of the product. Foods where there's processing contamination that could happen and require an industry-wide intervention. They also look at the consumption rate of the food. It wouldn't necessarily make sense for FDA to regulate foods that are not highly consumed, even if they represent a higher risk. And then additionally, FDA factored in the cost of the illnesses. And the cost of the illnesses is really focused on the cost of the illnesses, both to the individual as well as, really the community and world broader. So to discuss the foods that are specifically on the list, you will see that FDA has broken it off into some major categories and then explanations of each. So the products that are covered are cheeses other than hard cheeses. And the best way that I can describe this, since it can get really complicated in the food space or in the cheese space, because you've got these could hit a number of varieties, and FDA provides specific examples in the food traceability list itself. But basically, unless it's a hard cheese, think Gruyere, most Parmesan cheeses, you will likely be covered by this. So this is going to cover soft rind cheeses, ricottas, bries, really any of those types of products, some blue cheeses as well that fall under this. Additionally, they covered shell eggs. So these are eggs of domestic chickens that are still in the shell, not those that have been further processed. But if you are a shell egg producer, you still have obligations, even if the product is potentially being, transformed, which we'll talk about, into a non-food traceability list product. Nut butters are an obvious choice for FDA to include, and it's all forms of them. And this is any tree nut and peanut. And if you recall, the tree nuts include coconuts, which are not truly tree nuts. So those are also covered in this. And it includes all forms, shelf-stable, refrigerated, or frozen. Additionally, FDA is covering certain produce. So you'll notice that each of the produce has different designations, whether it is a fresh product or fresh cut. And basically what this does is FDA provides, it's not necessarily an exemption, but it would not cover or follow a product such as a dried herb that you receive at your facility. The fresh herb prior to it being dried would be covered. However, once it is transformed into something off the list, and it would then fall out of the regulatory requirements here. Additionally, FDA was very focused on fin fish, including fresh, frozen, and smoked, as well as crustaceans and molluscan shellfish. And then finally, they also look at ready-to-eat deli salads. And really, those are any that are refrigerated, whether they're produced, basically if they're produced wide scale and then sold to a retailer. In addition, there are a number of exemptions that are provided in the rule, and some of which are partial exemptions. While there may be some entities that are partially exempt from the regulations, note that it does not necessarily exempt you from all of the record-keeping requirements. You may still have some of those, such as, information regarding receipt of a product, but, you aren't necessarily subject to the full scope of the regulation. So those that are exempt are individuals or companies such as small producers, which FDA provides very specific dollar amount. You can't produce more than $25,000 in annual sales. And then also certain egg producers fall under that as well. Additionally, there are exemptions for farms that sell directly to consumers. So if you have a farm stand, you would not be subject to this requirement. Additionally, foods that receive processing that adequately reduces the presence of a microorganism of public health significance is really the big exemption, where many foods will fall outside of the being subject to the rule because they have been transformed and removed from either the Food Traceability List or they've been subject to a kill step. In those cases, there are some records that need to be are required to make and maintain. So you're not fully exempt. That one's one of those not fully exemptions. And the other alternative, so if it's subject to a kill step or the food is changed so that they're no longer on the Food Traceability List. So fresh spinach would be on the list as a fresh leafy green. However, frozen spinach would fall off the Food Traceability List. So there'd be certain steps in the supply chain that would be covered, and then past that, once the food is changed off of the Food Traceability List, then it no longer needs to be covered by this. Additionally, produce that is included on FDA's rarely consumed as raw are exempt from this, as well as a partial exemption for raw agricultural commodities. And these are commodities that, as well as certain commingled ones, these are ones that are combined or mixed after harvesting but prior to processing. Small food retail establishments and small restaurants are exempt. There are also partial exemptions for retail food establishments and restaurants that directly receive Food Traceability List food from a farm directly, as well as when these retail food establishments make purchases from other retail establishments. Again, a partial exemption there. But one thing, because we're going to talk about these key data elements, I get this question a lot is, I'm a trucking company. I'm moving around these foods on the Food Traceability List. Am I subject to this? And that's not the way that the rule works. Transporters of the food, so those transportation companies, are exempt from the traceability rule because the onus of making the CTE or tracking the critical events and then developing the key data elements is really on the shippers and receivers of the food, not the transport company. That comes up too with imported foods. If you happen to be the importer of record, but never take possession of the product, generally you would not need to follow the Food Traceability Rule requirements. However, the entity that does receive it would need to meet those requirements. So all of this really focuses on, obviously the traceability, but the data elements that you need to create. And one of the most important things that, falls in this are these traceability lot codes. And this is going to be different. This will be different potentially than your normal lot or batch codes for a product. A traceability lot may mean a batch or lot of food that was initially packed. received by the first land-based receiver, that's for fishing vessels, or products that are transformed. So that's when they are made. This lot code does not necessarily need to be created at the harvest or farming stage. It's actually done further down. And we'll have a couple of supply chain examples that'll show you where this traceability lot code piece gets triggered to follow the food all the way down. And then, as you'll note, the traceability lot code is only assigned, and this is what I'm talking about, at the specified critical points, or when a receiver is actually covered to handle the code. Additionally, you can use lot source code references, such as your food traceability registration number or a web address as the food location, instead of necessarily making that a part of your lot code traceability, since it is one of the key data elements. And once a food has been assigned a food traceability lot code by the manufacturer, holder, or packer of the product, that must include the key data elements at each critical tracking event and follow that code as the food moves down the supply chain. So as I shared, record keeping is really the big piece of this regulation. It is more so you can focus on tracking and tracing the food very swiftly. These are the different key or critical tracking events that FDA requires food to be maintained. So, or that are where you need to make your key data elements. So harvesting is going to be obviously focused for fish, shellfish, and produce. There are some exemptions on the harvesting piece for certain fishing vessels. Not all of them are necessarily subject to this. Additionally, cooling, which is before initial packing, is an event that needs to occur. This happens quite a bit in, again, the seafood and produce space, as well as the, before the initial packing piece. And then for seafood, when your vessel is exempt, it would be the first land-based receiver of the product. So who here on the mainland, accepted the product and received it, they're the ones who start making the key data elements there, unless it was already started due to a non-exempt fishing vessel. We're going to focus on, though, the shipping, receiving, and transformation pieces of the rule, primarily because they cross all types of foods. As you noted, those other ones really look at the, more so on the produce and seafood side, but all of the foods on the food traceability list are either going to be shipped, received, or potentially transformed at some point in its production process. So as an example, supply chain, we've pulled this very simple one that FDA has provided. So we'll go through, kind of see, you get the milk from the farm that goes to the manufacturer, as well as the ingredients. Now, you'll see this is really simple. For cheese manufacturers, you may have additional ingredients that are on the list, which would then create a very large, another piece of the supply chain that would get included into your traceability plan, such as herbs or peppers that may be included in your product. But you'll see here, the traceability lot code is generated here at the manufacturing level, because you are, creating a food subject to the traceability rule. This will be required so that your tracking event. And these are some of the key data elements that you would need to keep in this. So transformation is really the creation of the cheese to be subject to the rule. And then you ship it out to your distributors or potentially directly to a retailer. Similarly, if you're using distribution for this type of cheese, you would have a receiving key data element that this lot source code is going to follow these. Where you have evidence of the receiving, and we'll talk about the details of what goes in there, as well as when you ship it out to a retail customer. And retailers, this is where it kind of, there is a little bit of onus on them. They are required to also maintain receiving records. So what they receive generally at the store level. that is the way that FDA wants it to be managed. So it won't necessarily be managed at the higher corporate level. The individual stores will need to, they can work with their corporate entity, but they may themselves need to have this information, especially since the tracking and tracing and pulling from the shelves is really at that retail location. And you'll see things can get a little bit more complicated when you are doing additional activities, right? So this is fresh tomatoes that go both to retailers as well as direct-to-consumer meal kits. So you'll see the farm is exempt. Then you go to the harvesting step. You will note that the traceability lot code is not created there. So again, because it's exempt. So it is harvested, it is then sent to the cooling key data element, key step, and includes those key data elements. And then it moves on to the packing information, or the initial packing stage. Again, that's one of the locations where the traceability lot source code is generated. Then you will move to, say it gets shipped to a processor who cuts the tomatoes. So that is, cut vegetables is what, or cut tomatoes is what is covered by the rule, as well as fresh. So they take them and do whatever kind of processing they are. Because it's further processed, there is a new traceability lot code that is generated because it's a new product, but it continues to be on the food traceability rule, includes the receiving, transformation, and shipping key data elements. And the retailer would need to keep the receiving piece, but the direct to consumers, so consumers do not have the requirement to keep a receiving key data element. Another example is seafood. As I mentioned, fishing vessels can be fully or partially exempt. And the first land-based receiver is who received this product, who is subject to creating both the lot code, the traceability lot code, as well as these key tracking, these key data elements at these critical tracking events. That then may go to a seafood processor who, maybe transforms the product, maybe does not. In this case, it's not. And then it goes, or in this case, it is transforming it into a canned seafood, which then takes it, because that is not fresh, frozen, or smoked, would take it off of the food traceability list. And therefore, the distributor and the retail establishment are not going to receive these key data elements, nor be required to make and maintain records regarding that. Outside of, and I will say, outside of our one step forward, one step back requirements that FDA has been enforcing since we passed the Bioterrorism Act many, many years ago. FDA, because they recognized initially they only did a few of these supply chain examples, but they've come to learn that one size doesn't fit all, especially if you're going to regulate seafood where aquaculture may be involved, or you have imported products, or shell eggs, for example. FDA provides some supply chain examples that can help you work through and just be able to visualize where you may be subject to the rule and the type of information that you have to create. So, I highly recommend taking a look at those. The link to them is included at the bottom of the page, but it does help kind of visualize what you need to do in these, different stages to comply with the regulation. So as it relates to transformation, so that is one of our critical tracking steps that is fairly ubiquitous, or fairly ubiquitous for many food products. And this is, anything that involves manufacturing or processing or changing a food, and that final food is on the food traceability list. So a great example is cheese. It comes in as milk and other ingredients, including salt and rennet, and then suddenly it is a soft cheese, for example, that is included on the food traceability list. Therefore, record keeping requirements are going to be slightly different if you're creating a new food that is produced, or something that is a transformation of a food and then is further used as an ingredient. So for those food traceability foods that are used as ingredients, you only need to have the traceability lot code for that food, the product description for the food that gives the traceability lot code applies to. So, for example, if it is an ingredient that is used in a non-food traceability food, and then also for each of the traceability lot codes, they would FDA is requiring the quantity and unit of measure of the food that was used from that lot, basically to help you show maybe it was a very large lot, but you only used certain pieces in a food, such as, we'll say, a cut pepper that is going into a cheese. Again, sorry that I'm using a lot of cheese examples. It's just I know they can get a little complex sometimes. Both of those products would be in there. You could argue that so when it's used as an ingredient, you need to keep that information, but you would also have information for this newly generated food, which includes your new traceability lot code, if there was a previous one, a description of the location, so where you manufactured it. And again, that can be a lot source code, or you can use any other kind of identifier for where it is, maybe the city and state of where it was done, or as FDA indicated, the FDA food facility registration number. Additionally, you need to note when the transformation of the food was complete. So when did you finish manufacturing the product? A description for the food, so both you and FDA understand why it's covered, how much of that food you produced, and then also you should note that certain documentation requirements aren't applying to retail food establishments at the newly produced foods. So say they're producing a ready-to-eat deli salad in their store themselves, not necessarily selling it from something that was manufactured outside of their facility or their actual restaurant establishment. They would not need to follow this, even though they took potentially non-covered food traceability foods and then created it into one. They would fall out of those requirements. But if there are any food traceability foods on or in that product, they may have receiving data that they are required to make and maintain. Shipping is, again, very important because we're going to ship and receive quite a bit. That's how food moves around. This is really anywhere when a product is transported from one physical location to another. This includes intercompany shipments, as well as cross-docking. So FDA has very clearly said, if you do any of those things, it doesn't matter if it's going from your manufacturing facility to your own warehouse at another location, that is covered as the shipping and receiving. So that warehouse location would have the receiving key data elements there, and you would also have to have the shipping key data elements at that critical tracking event. And again, as we've talked, the key data elements have to be linked back to that traceability lot code. Again, they're really central in this regulation. And as a part of this key data element, you need to include all of the elements that are listed here on the screen. Again, that traceability lot code, the amount of food that was shipped, and or the unit of measure for it, a product description, many of the elements that you created in the transformation piece, or you already had to generate earlier at a receiving point, for example, for like a piece of produce, or let's say fresh cut cucumbers, because we know that they're covered. So, all of that information needs to be in there. And again, that needs to track the food when it is then finally received at the location. So this is when someone other than the consumer or any change in hands or transportation from one physical location to another, except for retailers to consumers, or if you're doing direct to consumer sales, those sales themselves. Again, you got to link it back to that traceability lot code. But one of the things that can get a little complicated, right, is there are many entities that are exempt. So say you receive a large shipment of cucumbers, fresh cucumbers from a small farm that is exempt from the requirements. Obviously, they would not, be subject to this rule, but the receiver is then the one who would assign the traceability lot code. Since harvesting is truly, it's a critical tracking event and there are very few PDEs that need to be saved, they would not necessarily be the one who does that traceability lot code, because the receiver is truly the one who does it because they're otherwise exempt from the regulations. And then again, many of the exact same data elements and record keeping requirements are included within the receiving key data element. So a lot of the information is going to pass through, but obviously some information such as locations and destinations will be changed. So as an example, to put it all together for, a manufacturer, we're going to look at it that way. A manufacturer who receives a food that's on the food traceability list would obviously have the receiving data with the listed key data, or would have that critical tracking event with the listed key data elements that are included with that. If they then go and transform it, again, they have this information, and you'll see it's kind of like a block of information. And then same with the shipping piece. So in this instance, really FDA would expect, that lot traceability code to be, depending on where it comes from, if it's not from, if you're receiving a food that's on the FTL list, you will likely already have a traceability lot code, but you may need to also assign it if you're getting it from one of those exempt facilities like we just talked about. And then again, if you look at a distributor, again, in the middle of the supply chain, they only have the receiving and the shipping because they're not doing any of those transformation or other key activities. So how does this all come together, right? It seems like a lot of information, and we're going to have another policy, procedure, and a bunch more records that FDA, gets to dig around for us to show that we can protect food safety and rapidly move, foods off the market. Really, the traceability plan is kind of a roadmap of your program and really details where information is located. So this is the procedures that you use to maintain the records, including the format and their location. One of the nice things, even though it was mandated by statute, is FDA doesn't tell you exactly how you have to do this. They did not say you must use a certain technology in order to meet these requirements. If you work quite a bit in the supply chain management side of your business, you'll hear a lot about blockchain. We've heard a lot about that in the food safety space. And the regulation is really written to make blockchain a very easy solution for you to do this, but it is not specifically required by the regulations. So again, you have to know the procedures and how you're going to keep the records and where you're keeping them if it's not at your facility itself. Additionally, you need to outline procedures on identifying foods on the food traceability list that you handle in some fashion, as well as how you're assigning the traceability lot codes where that is applicable. So if you're a harvester, you're not going to have that requirement. It'll be done either by the receiver or a manufacturer. So, again, you need to know and outline how you do that, just to make sure that a new traceability code, lot code, is assigned every time it is needed to be assigned, not just in general for all shipments from a certain farm. It needs to follow that lot or shipment of products. Again, the description of how you assign it is really very important. And then a statement identifying the point of contact for questions regarding the plan. So similar to any of, the way we set up policies and procedures in the food space, FDA specifically wants you to include in there who's responsible for this plan and who is it that they would talk to if they had questions regarding its robustness, compliance, or if they happen to see that these policies and procedures are not being followed. Additionally, you need to just update it on a regular basis to ensure that it reflects your current practices and is compliant with the rule. FDA also, though, requires, sometimes you can, take an old plan and shelf it for several years. FDA is also requiring you maintain your previous traceability plan for at least 2 years after you update it. And it's really because your traceability plan may have applied to a product that is still in the marketplace up to those 2 years. I know a lot of the products are highly perishable that are focused and subject to this rule. But again, it's just to make sure that there wasn't some significant change from one plan to another that would make it difficult to track and trace those products that were subject to a previous plan. Regarding the record keeping requirements, more specifically, similar to maintaining that old traceability plan for 2 years, FDA requires you to maintain records for 2 years as original paper or electronic records. And these must be, or you can maintain at your facility true copies of it, so long as the original paper or electronic records are maintained somewhere else. FDA wants them, like all records, to be legible. We do, especially in, the produce and retail space when we're receiving products, we do a lot of handwritten things, on, marking up or accepting a bill of lading or other information. And really, FDA is going to, wants to make sure that they can actually read it, and so can you, to make sure that you, have done these correct elements and are able, again, to quickly track and trace. Again, FDA allows you to use links within any electronic records. So if, say, for example, you maintain your batch records somewhere else or in a different location, you could, use an electronic link to link it in there. So you can, again, make sure that all of the appropriate food traceability foods are captured in that record. One of the big things that is a little different than FDA's normal requirement. Generally, if they request records, they'll give you a reasonable time. Obviously, they prefer it within 24 hours. In this instance, they must be made available to FDA unless FDA agrees to a more reasonable time frame. I will say, in the case of a recall where they're reviewing records or request records, do not expect that they will give you additional time. They will want that information, especially in the electronic sortable spreadsheet, within that 24 hours. So that's the other piece that is required to be made. FDA provides us another example of how you can maintain this information. So as you can see, this is the traceability lot code that was assigned here. In this instance, they used a UPC as well as, lot code information in order to follow this. They have the quantity and unit of measure. So it's 50 cases of this type of cheese that's described. It was received by Charles Cheese Company. That was where it was sourced from. It then, when it left your hands, it went to this distribution food service company. The date that they received it is here. And then here's the source location description. So again, it can be your address. It could be a Google link to that location, on Google Maps or something like that. And then the document reference and type number is something that you can include yourself, but it does help track those purchase orders or bills of lading, again, to those specific items. And the big thing to remember is the compliance date. And I know it sounds really far off, January 2026, but this is a pretty complicated rule. Unlike FDA's other regulations under FSMA, where they provided tiered compliance dates, so larger manufacturers were required to comply first, then medium, then small-size businesses. In this case, FDA is requiring all covered entities, so unless you are exempt, to be compliant. So have your traceability plan in place, as well as the way that, as of January 20, you start making and maintaining those records. You don't have to do it prior to that, even though we're in, what would be that 2-year period. But that is the compliance date where FDA expects you to have a plan prepared and begin making and maintaining the records required by this. So, that's one of the things that a lot of companies, they say like, oh, I'm a small business, I have an extra year, don't worry about it. But some of the best practices that we've been focused on in working with companies is really you need to get started on compliance as soon as possible regarding this. Again, it's a very complex rule. Supply chains can get very complex, and you need to make sure that you understand it and are educating both your suppliers as well as your potential customers, because they may have obligations under the rule. And it's kind of going to take everyone in the food industry for foods that are covered by the Food Traceability List to, make and maintain these records as required. We obviously recommend that you read the regulation. FDA has issued more guidance documents for this FSMA regulation than any other that is, well in advance of when, you need to comply with the rule. They have so much information there. I actually find it very helpful. It's not just a regurgitation of what's in the regulations. Really those supply chain examples, I'm a very visual person, so it helped me break down where certain elements of the rule are required. This is also potentially going to take an interdisciplinary team to address compliance. I don't see a quality like a person in charge of quality or food safety being able to do this on their own, partially because, the supply chain pieces and the education that needs to be done throughout your supply chain may take some of those other individuals to address. Additionally, the biggest thing is going to be to figure out how you're going to manage the tracing of these products and incorporate it into any current traceability practices that you have. Is this information, and how you're going to transmit the information to whomever is receiving the product. Are you going to include it on the bill of lading, a purchase order, something that is accompanying the food, because it needs to do that. It needs to accompany that food so they can start making their part of their records. And then we recommend that companies think broadly about how you're going to accept information from a food, from a supplier of an FTL food. And really that's because FDA doesn't mandate one specific way that you comply with the rule or any technologies that you use. And you may receive information from your suppliers in different ways. They may choose to, one may choose to go the blockchain route. And we all know that that is a large capital investment behind it and takes a lot of work to do that. But if you're not on the blockchain, how are you going to receive that information and be able to make sure that it follows you meet your obligations? So that's one of the things that you need to be aware of. It's really going to take a lot of work together to make sure that you actually know where the information is that they claim that they're providing you, and you help them identify where that information is as well on the records and transfer of the information. Additionally, one thing that comes up quite a bit is, I'm a foreign supplier of X, Y, and Z food traceability food requirement. What do I need to do? I'm already subject, my U.S. importer is already subject to FSVP. Why do I have this new requirement? But they also are subject to it. They, depending on their role in the supply chain, will need to make and maintain these records as well. So especially when you have some supply chains where things move really quickly, like produce, you can place an order and it's shipped into the country the next day, depending on where it's coming from. They're going to need to make sure that they're ready, come January 2026, and actually understand what they need to do in order for everybody to be in compliance. One thing with foreign suppliers is you could consider including this as an element or a part of your FSVP plan. It's not required, but that is part of how you could make sure that your foreign suppliers are following these requirements. I'm an attorney, so I'm obviously going to bring you additional legal things that you should consider. So one of the things that some companies have been very concerned about is whether or not they're going to be transferring, commercial confidential information or trade secret that generally would not be provided to, let's say, a receiver of the product, so one of your customers. Basically what you need to do, and this is again why planning is really very important, is you really want to make sure that you're providing only the information that is needed, and you have set up a policy that doesn't have that trade secret information transmitted. I get a lot of times where, especially if you have a distributor or somebody a broker that doesn't necessarily want to provide the information about who the supplier is or anything like that. And unfortunately, if you have a food traceability list food, you're going to have to provide that information under this. So there's a little bit more opening up of that supply chain transparency here. But some of the things that you may be concerned about are, the supplier information, contact names, those kinds of things, how the food is processed, if there's any kind of trade secret or you have a very special logistics process, as well as recipes for foods. Obviously, recipes are trade secret and generally you would not want to share. And then additionally, you're going to want to look at your supply agreements to the extent that they exist to make sure that this element is included in there. Really, it's not just an obligation to follow the, regulations of the FDA. We need to do a little bit more here because there are instances if, say, for example, you have a food that's on the FTL and it's going to be subject to a kill step, so it falls off the list. You could, in that instance, or in order to, not necessarily have to keep the receiving key data element, that food processor could agree in a written agreement that they are, going to do this kill step and therefore they're not maintaining the receipt record. So, that's one of the things that you need to make sure that those obligations are clear, who's doing what and how that information is flowing between supplier and, your receiver. Additionally, if you're using any kind of third-party technology to assist with this, whether it's a vendor or, maybe you're developing it yourself, you really want to make sure that you understand data protection and ownership of that information. That's just our data. Data is extremely important and extremely valuable. So, the individuals within your company may want to be, a little bit more protective over some of that and have those considerations. And then another thing that I think is, it's kind of unique to seafood, but it could be in others. This might help you comply with other regulatory requirements or satisfy your customer and consumer expectations regarding supply chain transparency. And when I think about this in the seafood space, I think about compliance with NOAA's Seafood Import Monitoring Program. While that shipping vessel may be exempt from the Food Traceability Rule, you may consider requiring them to generate this information or include it on their fishing records so you can more easily comply with the Seafood Import Monitoring Program. It's just a thought to kind of tackle two birds with one stone, but it is a way that, this can help you meet other legal as well as customer obligations or expectations. So with that, I am happy to take any questions that anybody may have. I see that we have one in the chat, which I will read. It says, if you have a fresh spinach changing into a frozen spinach, would you maintain transformation records as normal and then not to have to maintain shipping records? In that case, FDA would expect that you so you're the manufacturer who's making it into frozen spinach. You would have a receipt key data element, and then it would end there. The transformation piece is focused on whether or not foods, you would still include the transformation one because you want to show that that fresh spinach was turned into frozen spinach. So you would have those two key data elements, but you would not need to have the shipping key data elements. Okay, so the next question is regarding strained yogurt, and it says, would it be considered a soft cheese in the food traceability list? This is complicated. Because those products are generally regulated as a yogurt product, and that's really how they're seen by FDA, they should fall out of the definition of soft cheese. I know they act a little bit more, like a ricotta or a mascarpone cheese, but at least as FDA has defined it, it does not expand to those types of products. So you should be fine with a Greek or other strained type of yogurt. So that would not be subject to this, but some ingredients in that finished product may be subject to the rule. Okay, so that looks like all the questions in the chat. In the event anybody else has some, happy to take them now or offline as well. But, the big takeaway on this is we need to get started with compliance early on this. The reason we're doing this at the end of 2023, it's a whole, 2 years out, right, from compliance. I see this regulation as taking a lot of work. it's going to take a lot of work on your part and your company and potentially investment to do it because it's so new. And, you know, we really need to think about how we're doing this because there's going to be a lot of exchange of information that may not come in the form that you expect or may not come in a form that is readily able to be put into your records, you know, such as your searchable spreadsheets. So, you know, we have to be very mindful about those types of things. So that's why we're talking about this early. And if you're considering making any large capital investments, 2024 is the time to plan for that. If you're going to use like a third-party technology to help with this, 2024 is to evaluate those and plan it. 2025 is to develop it, so you're ready by January 6, 2026. You know, just, you know, thinking ahead to make sure that you can kind of, you know, get ahead of the ball. We expect FDA to, you know, do their similar educate while regulating, but I don't think we're going to have as long of a leash as we did with the preventive controls rule and foreign supplier verification. And just, you know, FDA may just do a random records check as well. You know, that's something they can do as part of an inspection, whether they're doing a standard one or not. So that's why they want you to be ready with this information. So another question is to confirm IFQ or dried herbs are not covered. That is correct. The herbs would be covered when they are fresh. So whether you're doing the drying yourself or if you're receiving dried herbs, that would not be covered under the rule. But the individual who is harvesting as well as transforming it into a dried herb would be covered by the rule. So your receipt would not be covered by that if it was dried by the time you received it. Another question is, are R&D and trade show foods exempt? This is always one of my favorite questions because the regulations don't clearly indicate that they are exempt, nor does FDA provide any guidance that would exempt them. So the way that we would approach this is they're covered. You know, that's generally what we would recommend until FDA provides further clarification regarding a research and development or trade show exemption. So, any other questions? All right, well, we can wrap up early. My contact information is available through this system as well as on the slides if you download them. So thank you for joining us today. We hope that the information was helpful to you and your organization. As a reminder, this program has been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance will, including the course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Be sure to complete our survey because we use your feedback both on this as well as other topics that may be of interest to you so that we're providing information to you that meet your business needs. Thank you so much. This concludes our webinar.